In August of 1947, 5 fishermen sailed back into a small Alaskan harbor a full day early, their boat undamaged, their catch barely touched, and every one of them refusing to say why. The harbor master logged the time. A local reporter noted their faces, and according to accounts that survive from that week, not one of those 5 men ever gave a consistent explanation for what sent them back to shore. They weren't hurt. They weren't drunk. They were, by every description that survives, simply unwilling to talk. What they see on that water, and why, more than 70 years later, does their silence still feel like the loudest part of this story? This is a story built from surviving harbor logs, a scattering of regional newspaper coverage, and the oral history of a small fishing community along Alaska's coast that has quietly carried this story for generations. Some of what follows is documented with real confidence. Some of it isn't, and we'll be careful throughout to draw that line clearly. To understand why this particular incident still puzzles people who've looked into it, you need to understand what Alaska's coastal waters actually meant to the people working them in 1947. In the years following the Second World War, Alaska's fishing industry was entering a period of real growth. Salmon canneries dotted the coastline, and small independent fishing crews, often working boats owned by a single family or a tight partnership of a few men, made their living pulling salmon, halibut, and other catch from waters that could turn calm to violent within a matter of hours. This was, and remains, some of the most unpredictable maritime environment in North America, shaped by narrow channels, sudden fog, and currents that even experienced captains treated with real caution. The men who fished these waters were not easily rattled. Alaska's coastal fishing communities in this era were built by people who had chosen, or inherited, a genuinely dangerous livelihood, and who understood that survival depended on sound judgment, rather than panic. That matters enormously for what follows, because whatever sent this particular crew back to harbor a day early was not, by any reasonable account, the reaction of superstitious or inexperienced men. It's also essential to understand that these carry a history far older than the fishing industry itself. The coastal regions of southeast and south-central Alaska have been home to Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, and other indigenous peoples for many thousands of years, communities with deep, sophisticated maritime knowledge and rich oral traditions describing the waters, the weather, and the creatures understood to inhabit this coastline. Traditional stories among various coastal nations describe encounters with beings and phenomena tied to the sea, understood within complex spiritual and cultural frameworks developed over countless generations of lived experience on these exact waters. It is important to state this respectfully and without embellishment. These are living oral traditions belonging to real, present-day communities, not folklore to be borrowed for entertainment value or treated as evidence toward any specific claim. When American and European fishermen and settlers arrived in these waters in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, they frequently encountered fragments of these traditions, sometimes secondhand, sometimes poorly translated, and folded elements of them into their own maritime folklore, often stripped of their original context and meaning in the process. By the 1940s, fishing communities along this coast, made up of a genuinely diverse mix of indigenous, Scandinavian, Filipino, and other immigrant and multi-generational families, had developed their own layered body of maritime folklore, blending older indigenous traditions with the folk beliefs common to fishing cultures worldwide. Sailors and fishermen everywhere have long told stories of strange lights on the water, of unexplained shapes glimpsed at a distance, of certain channels or coves best avoided, if conditions allowed. Some of this almost certainly reflected genuine, if imperfectly understood, echoes of older indigenous knowledge about the sea. Some of it was simply the ordinary folklore that develops among people who spend their lives on unpredictable, often dangerous water. Regional maritime records from this era do document something more concrete alongside this folklore, though it deserves to be treated with appropriate caution. Local harbor logs and newspaper archives from several Alaskan fishing communities in the decades before and after 947 occasionally reference boats returning early or crews reporting unusual sightings on the water, described in vague and inconsistent terms that resist easy categorization. This is a genuinely thin evidence, and it should be treated as exactly that, suggestive, not conclusive, of a broader, if rarely discussed, pattern along this coastline. So even before we reach the specific events of August 947, there's a documented, if modest, backdrop. Something about these waters occasionally produced strange, only partially explained reports, treated by the communities themselves with a mixture of caution and reluctance to elaborate publicly. What happened to this particular crew that August that made their case different enough to still be discussed generations later? According to surviving harbor records from a small fishing community on Alaska's southern coast, a boat crewed by 5 men departed on what was described, in the limited paperwork that survives, as a standard multi-day fishing trip in early August of 1947. The boat itself, based on harbor registration records, was a modest commercial fishing vessel, typical of the independent operations common along this coast at the time, crewed by men with genuine, established experience working these waters. According to a surviving article published in a small regional newspaper later that same month, one of the very few contemporary written accounts describing this specific incident, the boat returned to harbor on the evening of what should have been only the second day of a planned 4 to 5 day trip. The article describes the harbor master noting the unusually early return in his log, along with an observation that the crew appeared, in his words as quoted by the paper, shaken but unharmed. That detail, shaken but unharmed, is doing a great deal of work in this story, and it's worth sitting with. It rules out the most obvious mundane explanations right away. This wasn't a mechanical failure. It wasn't a medical emergency. It wasn't bad weather forcing an early return. Since regional weather records from the period, no significant storm activity along that stretch of coast during the days in question. So, was it? The newspaper account offers frustratingly limited detail, consistent with how thinly reported this kind of story would have been in a small regional paper of this era, without the kind of investigative follow-up that a more significant event might have received. It references, in volumes attributed to unnamed harbor witnesses, that the crew described encountering something unusual on the water during the previous night, though the article itself declines to specify that something allegedly was, noting only that the men themselves were unwilling to elaborate for the record. That reluctance is the detail that has kept this story alive for over 70 years. Fishermen who returned early from a trip, cutting short income they depended on, would ordinarily have a clear, specific reason and would generally be willing to explain it, if only to protect their reputation among other captains and crews who might otherwise assume carelessness or poor judgment. Instead, according to accounts that survive, all 5 men gave vague, inconsistent, or simply refused answers when pressed by others in the small harbor community over the following days and weeks. According to local oral history, recorded decades later as part of a regional historical society project, documenting the area's fishing heritage. Descendants of at least two of the crew members described family stories passed down about that August night. These accounts, understandably shaped and by decades of retelling, generally agree on a few consistent details. That the crew described seeing something large and unusual during nighttime hours. That whatever it was did not match any vessel or natural phenomenon the men recognized from years of experience on that water. And that the men, by unanimous and apparently immediate agreement, decided to return to harbor rather than continue the trip. 5 experienced fishermen, choosing together, without recorded disagreement, to sacrifice several days of planned income and return home early. That kind of unanimous, immediate consensus among hardened, financially motivated working men is the detail that resists easy dismissal as simple exaggeration or coincidence. What makes this case distinct from other loosely documented maritime folklore along this coast is the surviving harbor log entry itself, an actual, dated and contemporaneous record confirming the early return, made by a harbor master with no apparent reason to embellish or fabricate the entry. That single piece of hard documentation is what separates this story from pure oral legend, and what has kept local historians and the occasional outside researcher returning to it over the decades since. According to the same regional oral history project, the crew members reportedly maintained their silence for the remainder of their lives. One account describes a crew member, decades later and in poor health, telling a family member only that some things are better left on the water, and declining even then to say more. Another account describes a different crew member simply changing the subject whenever the trip came up, for the rest of his life, without ever appearing angry or evasive, just quietly, consistently unwilling to revisit it. That kind of consistent, lifelong reticence across multiple separate men who otherwise lived ordinary, well-documented lives within their community is genuinely unusual. It's not the pattern you'd expect from 5 men covering up an embarrassing but mundane mistake. It's closer to the pattern of people who witnessed something they simply never found adequate words for, and chose, deliberately and consistently, not to try. If mysteries like this one, built on real archival fragments and honest uncertainty rather than manufactured drama, are what keeps you watching, this channel exists exactly for stories like it. Subscribe now, because what maritime researchers have documented about this same stretch of Alaskan coast in the decades since only adds another layer to this story. So, does more careful historical examination actually tell us here? This is where a responsible investigation has to slow down and resist the pull toward the most dramatic available explanation. The most straightforward and statistically most probable explanation involves ordinary maritime misidentification under difficult nighttime conditions. Alaska's coastal waters host a remarkable range of genuinely large marine life, including gray whales, humpback whales, and orcas, animals whose surfacing behavior, particularly at night or in poor visibility, has startled experienced sailors throughout maritime history. A large marine mammal surfacing unexpectedly close to a small fishing vessel in darkness could easily produce a genuinely frightening, difficult-to-process experience, even for men with years on the water, particularly if the animal's size, movement, or behavior differed from what the crew was accustomed to encountering. That's not a dismissive explanation. Startling encounters with large marine wildlife are well documented throughout maritime history worldwide, and fear responses to sudden, unexpected proximity to something large and under in darkness are a well understood, entirely rational human reaction, regardless of how experienced the observer might otherwise be. There's also a more mundane possibility worth taking seriously. This was, after all, just 2 years after the end of the Second World War, a period during which military activity, including submarine operations and various naval exercises, remained present along parts of the Alaskan coast as Cold War tensions began quietly building. It's entirely plausible that the crew had some form of military vessel or activity that night, one they were unable to clearly identify in darkness, and that a combination of genuine confusion and a reluctance to discuss military-adjacent activity, common during this early Cold War period, contributed to their lasting silence on the matter. Official records offer limited additional clarity, and it's worth explaining that honestly, rather than treating the gap as inherently suspicious, small regional fishing incidents that didn't involve injury, significant property damage, or loss of life were not typically subject to any formal government reporting requirement in 1947, and the Coast Guard and other relevant maritime authorities of this era had neither the obligation nor, frankly, to investigate every unusual report from independent commercial fishing crews along such an extensive stretch of coastline. The absence of an official investigative file is consistent with the general thinness of period maritime incident documentation, not necessarily evidence of anything being deliberately withheld. There's a connection worth exploring here carefully, without overstating what it proves. Elsewhere along the Alaskan and broader Pacific Northwest coast, maritime historians and folklore researchers have documented a genuine, recurring pattern of unusual sighting from experienced fishing crews throughout the 20th century, apparently attributed by researchers to some combination of misidentified marine wildlife, unfamiliar vessel activity, and the well-documented perceptual challenges of nighttime observation on open water. If our 1947 incident is within this broader, better documented pattern, it wouldn't stand as an isolated anomaly, but as one more entry in a genuinely recurring category of maritime experience along this coastline. At the same time, that broader pattern doesn't tell us with certainty what these 5 specific men actually encountered that night, and it would be overreaching to claim it does. So where does this leave us at the end of this particular thread of Alaska's coastal history? We have a hard, contemporaneous harbor log entry confirming an unusual, unexplained early return. We have a regional newspaper account, thin but genuine, describing a shipping crew, and a vague, unelaborated reference to something encountered on the water. We have consistent oral history, gathered independently from multiple descendant families, describing a lifelong, apparently voluntary silence maintained by all 5 men. And we have a reasonable evidence set of possible explanations, from marine wildlife encounters to unidentified vessel activity, none of which can be confirmed or ruled with the surviving record available to us. What we don't have, and what an honest telling of this story requires acknowledging plainly, is any way to know with real certainty what those 5 men actually saw off the Alaskan coast that August night in 1947. The men who knew are long gone, and whatever they chose to keep, they kept completely, all the way to the end of their lives. Maybe that's the most honest note to end on. Not every mystery resolves into a satisfying answer, and this may be one that genuinely shouldn't. What we're left with is a harbor log entry, a boat that came home a day early, and 5 men who spent the rest of their lives choosing silence over explanation, even when there was seemingly nothing left for them to lose by finally speaking. Was it a startled encounter with a whale, surfacing too close in the dark? Was it a piece of unfamiliar Cold War-era naval activity, quietly never discussed? Or was it something the historical record simply failed to capture, carried instead in 5 men's memories until each of them, one by one, took it with them. We may never know for certain, and perhaps that lingering uncertainty is exactly why this story has survived quietly for more than 70 years. What do you think those 5 fishermen saw off Alaskan coast, 1947? Share your theory in the comments. I genuinely read every one. And if you appreciate history told honestly, without inventing answers where none truly exist, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the past.